Imagine this. You're a soldier. The ground beneath your boots is frozen solid. The air cuts through your lungs like shards of glass. And every breath feels like fire and ice at the same time. But here's the question: are you standing in Russia during World War I? Or are you trudging through the bitter snow of Europe in World War II? 2 wars, 2 winters, 2 armies of men who believed they could endure anything. But which one broke first? Which icy hell swallowed soldiers alive not through bullets and shells but through hunger, frostbite, and despair? In World War I, Russian soldiers faced shortages so severe they marched barefoot through the snow, clothed in rags, with rifles shared between them. In World War II, American soldiers dug foxholes in frozen ground during the Battle of the Bulge, their fingers too numb to pull the trigger, their stomachs gnawed by hunger. This is not just about strategy or victories, it's about survival. It's about the limits of the human body, the breaking point of the human spirit. And tonight, we'll find out which winter was truly the cruelest. Stay with me because the story you're about to hear will change how you see both wars forever. The story of soldiers in winter is not one of glorious charges or dazzling heroics. It is one of endurance, suffering, and survival against an enemy far more merciless than any opposing army, nature itself. When we compare the frozen battlefields of World War I Russia with the snowbound struggles of World War II America, we aren't just looking at different centuries or different armies, we're staring into 2 portraits of human beings stretched to the edge of their will to live. Let us begin with Russia. 1914. When the Great War erupted, the Russian Empire marched millions of men to the front. But while they carried the banner of one of the world's largest empires, they were frighteningly unprepared. Russia's vast population was a strength in numbers, but the cracks appeared immediately in supply, organization, and leadership. By the winter of 1914, Russian soldiers were already facing shortages of boots, coats, and even rifles. Imagine this: a soldier sent to the trenches of Poland or East Prussia, armed with nothing more than a wooden stick, told to wait until a comrade fell so he could pick up his rifle. And the snow never waited. Temperatures plunged, and men with no gloves wrapped rags around their hands until frostbite ate away their fingers. But what did that mean for morale? It meant despair. It meant men whispering in the night about betrayal from their own government, about fighting a war for which they were nothing more than cannon fodder. The Russian winter was not just a weapon of the Germans, it was a silent executioner. Thousands froze to death, not in battle, but simply sitting in trenches that had turned into icy graves. Now, fast forward to December 1944. A different war, a different army, and yet a strangely familiar scene. American soldiers, proud, well-fed, and supplied compared to their Russian counterparts in 1914, suddenly found themselves trapped in the Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge, the last great German offensive of the war, came in the heart of winter. Snow fell thick, blinding men, muffling sounds, cutting visibility. Soldiers dug desperately into frozen ground, their hands bleeding as they tried to carve foxholes with shovels that rang against earth as hard as stone. The US Army had better logistics than the Russians ever did. Yes, but winter laughs at logistics. Trucks froze. Engines refused to start. Fuel lines clogged with ice. And the soldiers? Their rations froze solid. Canned food was so hard it had to be thawed over fire. But a fire meant smoke, and smoke meant death from artillery. Many went hungry, gnawing at frozen bread that cut the roof of their mouths like shards of glass. So here we have 2 images. On one side, Russian peasants in 1914, untrained and ill-equipped, shivering in wool that was thinner than paper, rifles scarce, hope scarcer. On the other side, Americans in 1944, the so-called best-supplied army in the world, suddenly realizing that no amount of industrial might could warm frozen flesh or ease the agony of trenchfoot. But here is the haunting question: which broke first? Was it the Russians, who deserted by the thousands, mutinied, and eventually helped spark a revolution that toppled their Tsar? Or was it the Americans, whose endurance in the Ardennes stretched to the very edge of collapse until General Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve them? The Russian soldier in World War I often died not from bullets, but from starvation and exposure. The American soldier in World War II often survived, but at what cost? To his mind, his spirit, his will to trust in war ever again. Which is worse, to die quickly in the snow, or to live on forever haunted by it? And this is only the beginning, because before we answer the question of which winter broke soldiers first, we must journey deeper. We must hear the cries from the Eastern Front in World War I, where men marched into battle barefoot, and compare them to the frozen Ardennes, where GIS huddled in foxholes, whispering prayers through chattering teeth. The next chapter will take us into the heart of the Russian trenches, where desperation, hunger, and frost collided with revolution, a place where men began to ask themselves not how to fight, but why to fight at all. What happens when an army is sent to fight not just an enemy, but the winter itself? What happens when soldiers realize that the greatest threat to their survival is not a German bullet, but the cold breath of January sweeping across the Russian plains? The Eastern Front of World War I was unlike anything Europe had seen before. It was vast, stretching for nearly 1,000 miles, where battles didn't just engulf towns, they swallowed entire nations. And when winter came, it came with a cruelty that neither strategy nor bravery could resist. The Russian soldier of 1915 was, in truth, more peasant than warrior. He had been pulled from the fields, handed a uniform that barely fit, and told to march. But here was the tragedy: the uniform was often incomplete. Some men had coats, but no boots. Others had boots, but no rifle. And many had nothing at all but the will to survive. By the time the bitter cold settled in, they were already fighting a second war against frostbite. Imagine trudging across the snow with bare feet wrapped in rags. The snow doesn't forgive. It burns the skin, blackens the toes, and spreads infection. Frostbite wasn't just a wound, it was a death sentence. And yet, men were still ordered to advance. They stumbled forward, their breath freezing in the air, their hands too numb to grip their rifles. When the guns roared, many soldiers collapsed, not from wounds, but simply because their bodies had surrendered to the cold. Food was another torment. The Russian supply lines were long, chaotic, and often broken. Soldiers survived on black bread so hard they had to soften it in water, if water was even available. Meat was rare, and when it came, it was often spoiled. Hunger gnawed at the stomach more cruelly than any bayonet. Men wrote letters home begging for parcels, for dried fish, for anything that could remind them of life before the trenches. But mails seldom reached them. The silence of winter brought another horror, the silence of despair. When snow covered the trenches, when no battles raged, when only the howl of the wind answered the cries of men, thoughts turned inward. Why are we here? Why are we dying in fields that don't belong to us? The Germans are not our true enemy. Some whispered, the real enemy sits in palaces far away, feasting while we freeze. And those whispers spread past from soldier to soldier, until they grew into something that frightened the generals more than German artillery, the seeds of revolution. By 1916, the cracks were undeniable. Soldiers deserted in staggering numbers. Whole units refused to march. Men sabotaged their own weapons to avoid combat. Some went so far as to turn their anger on their officers, dragging them into the snow and beating them to death. The winter had stripped away obedience, loyalty, and fear. The soldier was no longer a soldier, he was a man, starving, freezing, and questioning why he should fight at all. But while Russia's army began to unravel, the Germans faced the same cold. Yet somehow, they held together. Why? Because Germany's supply system, though strained, was more organized. Their soldiers received better boots, better coats, and most importantly, better food. They still suffered, yes, but they did not suffer as their enemies did. And when one army suffers more than another, the outcome is inevitable. The Russian winter, instead of protecting Russia, as it would later do in World War II, betrayed its own men in World War I. It was not an ally, it was an executioner, taking the weakest, breaking the strongest, until the army collapsed into chaos. And so the question must be asked, was it the snow that defeated Russia? Or was it hunger, corruption, and despair that came wrapped in the snow's embrace? The truth is that winter does not act alone. Winter is a magnifier. It takes every weakness, every failure, and every mistake, and it multiplies them until even the bravest men cannot endure. But now, let us leave Russia's frozen trenches and leap forward in time. For while Russian soldiers in World War I succumbed to the cold, far away and decades later, another army would face the same test. The Americans at the Battle of the Bulge believed themselves unbreakable. They had trucks, tanks, supplies, and a nation's industry at their back. Yet the Ardennes winter would teach them a lesson that no textbook could prepare them for. Before we go there, remember this: the Russian winter did not merely kill men, it changed the course of history. It sowed rebellion, ignited revolution, and brought down an empire that had stood for centuries. And in doing so, it asked a question that still lingers in history's coldest corners: what breaks first, the body or the will? In the next chapter, we step into the Ardennes. Snow blankets the forests, tanks lie hidden beneath white camouflage, and young Americans discover that winter has no favorites. Will they endure better than the Russians did? Or will the cold claim them too? What does it feel like to fight in a place where the forest itself seems determined to kill you? Where the snow isn't just cold, but suffocating, blinding your eyes, silencing your ears, and burying your hope? The Ardennes in December 1944 was supposed to be quiet. Soldiers called it a ghost front, a resting place where new divisions could recover, reorganize, and prepare for battles ahead. But war never respects silence. On December 16th, the forest erupted with the thunder of German artillery. And just like that, the calm winter landscape became the setting for one of the most desperate struggles in American history, the Battle of the Bulge. The first shock wasn't the shells, it was the snow. Soldiers awoke to chaos, running for cover, trying to man defenses, but the ground betrayed them. Foxholes could not be dug in frozen soil, which like hacking at stone. Men clawed at the earth with shovels, with bayonets, even with their bare hands, as explosions rained down. They bled before the bullets even reached them. And then came the cold. Sub-zero temperatures turned rifles into lumps of metal that froze to skin. Machine guns jammed, grease hardened like glue. Soldiers who tried to fire sometimes found their weapons locked solid, useless against waves of German armor pushing through the forest. The Americans, who thought themselves technologically advanced, were suddenly reduced to helplessness by nothing more than ice. Food, too, betrayed them. So rations froze into solid bricks. Chocolate shattered like glass. Coffee turned to ice before it could be swallowed. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, while thirst clawed at their throats because snow, though everywhere, could not be eaten without risking sickness. They melted it slowly in helmets over fires, but fires risked detection, and so they learned to live with the ache of emptiness. The Germans, dressed in white camouflage, seemed like phantoms. They appeared out of the snow, fired, then vanished again. Panic spread among American lines, because who was the enemy, and who was a friend? German commandos, disguised in American uniforms, infiltrated behind the lines, spreading confusion, misdirection, and fear. Soldiers no longer trusted the man standing next to them. Every snow-covered road could hide an ambush. Every shadow in the forest might conceal a killer. The Ardennes winter was not just cold, it was isolating. Men huddled together in foxholes, but still felt utterly alone. Letters from home took weeks to arrive, if they arrived at all. Supplies were cut off, roads blocked, bridges blown. Entire units went dark, surrounded, cut off from the world. And in that silence, in that frozen loneliness, the question grew heavy in their minds. Would anyone come to save them? But the most haunting truth of the Ardennes was not just the suffering, it was the endurance. American soldiers did not break as quickly as the Russian army had in 1917. They held. They fought back. They endured hell, even when surrounded. Bastogne became the symbol of this defiance. The 101st Airborne, trapped in the town, freezing, starving, running low on ammunition, refused to surrender. When the Germans demanded their capitulation, General McAuliffe famously replied with a single word: nuts. It was not bravado. It was survival through defiance. These soldiers, shivering in basements, bleeding in foxholes, whispered to one another not of mutiny or revolution, but of holding on until relief came. And relief did come. Patton's Third Army pushed through the snow, breaking the siege, proving that even in the harshest winter, discipline, organization, and hope could keep an army alive. But make no mistake, the Americans paid dearly. More than 80,000 casualties, thousands frozen, thousands more scarred for life by frostbite and trauma. For those who survived, winter remained with them forever. Some lost fingers, toes, entire limbs. Others carried invisible wounds, memories of comrades frozen stiff beside them, of nights when their own hearts seemed ready to give out from the cold. So, here is the chilling question. Who suffered more, the Russians, who froze with empty hands and empty bellies in World War I, or the Americans who endured with courage but left pieces of their bodies and souls behind in World War II? The Russians broke apart. Their winter sowed rebellion and collapse. The Americans bent, but did not break. Yet, is breaking only measured by desertion and surrender? Or is it measured by the pain etched forever into the survivors' lives? As we turn the page, we step back from the snow itself and look deeper at the human cost. The way winter reshaped not just battles, but nations. For Russia, it was the spark of revolution. For America, it was the cementing of resilience and eventual victory. But both were left asking the same haunting question. When the battlefield turns white, who really wins? And in the next chapter, we will compare not just their suffering, but their choices, the decisions of leaders, the strategies of survival, and the way each winter changed the course of world history. What breaks an army faster, the enemy's guns, or its own leaders' mistakes? Can a general's choices in the warmth of a headquarters decide whether men live or freeze in the trenches? When we compare Russia in World War I with America in World War II, it is not enough to look only at the soldiers. We must also look at the men who commanded them. Because in the frozen crucible of war, survival often depended less on courage and more on the decisions of those far removed from the biting wind and the bloodied snow. For the Russian Empire, the cracks began at the top. Tsar Nicholas II, desperate to prove himself as a leader, took direct command of the army in 1915. But his move was a disaster. He had no real military experience, no grasp of modern warfare, and little understanding of the suffering endured by his men. From the safety of palaces and offices, he sent orders that looked logical on maps, but spelled doom in the field. Soldiers were told to march without boots, to attack without ammunition, to hold positions with no food. Every poor decision echoed through the ranks like a death sentence. Behind the lines, corruption flourished. Supplies meant for soldiers disappeared into the pockets of officers, or were sold on the black market. Grain rotted in warehouses while men starved in the trenches. Warm clothing was hoarded by those with influence, while peasants turned soldiers shivered in rags. This betrayal was more devastating than any German artillery barrage. For a soldier, freezing in the snow, it was not just his body that broke, it was his faith in his leaders, in his Tsar, in the very nation he was dying to protect. Contrast this with America in 1944. The American command, while far from perfect, understood one truth: morale was a weapon as vital as bullets. General Eisenhower, overseeing the Allied campaign, knew that the Battle of the Bulge would be decided not just by tanks and planes, but by whether American soldiers believed they could hold out. He visited the front personally, showing his presence even in the snow, a gesture that reassured men that they had not been abandoned. But the most remarkable leadership came from those closer to the frost and fire. At Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe faced impossible odds. His men were surrounded, cut off from supplies, and freezing in cellars and foxholes. When German envoys demanded surrender, McAuliffe's blunt reply, "Nuts," was more than defiance. It was a lifeline. It told his soldiers that even though they were starving, even though the snow pressed in like a coffin, they were not beaten. Leaders like McAuliffe understood something the Russian High Command never grasped, that sometimes a single word of courage could be as nourishing as bread, as warming as fire. Yet leadership was not only about speeches, it was about logistics. the invisible veins that fed armies. In Russia, supply lines collapsed under poor planning and corruption. In America, they froze, yes, but they did not collapse. Convoys of trucks braved the icy roads. Airplanes risked snowstorms to drop supplies into Even when food and ammunition were scarce, the effort to keep them flowing never stopped. The Russian soldier felt abandoned by his country. The American soldier, though hungry and frozen, felt that somewhere behind the lines, someone was fighting to keep him alive. That belief kept him standing. Still, leadership was not without flaws. In the Ardennes, American commanders initially underestimated the German offensive, believing the forest too dense and the weather too harsh for a major attack. That mistake cost thousands of lives in the first days of the battle. But unlike the Russians, the Americans adapted quickly. Reinforcements were mobilized, counterattacks planned, and strategies adjusted. Leadership failures were not ignored, they were corrected. But here lies the haunting truth. Even the best decisions could not erase the suffering. Soldiers in both wars endured nights where their bodies shook uncontrollably from cold, where they wondered if they would wake in the morning or simply drift into a frozen sleep. Leaders could move divisions on maps, but they could not change the reality of frostbite eating away at toes, of hunger hollowing out bellies, of despair whispering in the silence of the snow. So then, what truly determined survival? Was it leadership? Was it logistics? Or was it something deeper, the ability of soldiers to cling to faith? Whether in their leaders, their comrades, or in the hope that tomorrow might be warmer than today. For Russia, leadership failed, and the winter magnified every weakness until the army shattered. For America, leadership bent under the storm but did not break. And in that endurance, soldiers found strength to survive. And yet, both winters left scars. The Russian soldier, betrayed and broken, turned his suffering into revolution, tearing down the empire he no longer believed in. The American soldier, though victorious, carried his wounds home, some physical, some invisible, all unforgettable. But winter is not only about the battlefield. It is also about what comes after the echoes of suffering. The way nations remember, and the myths they build around survival. In Russia, the frozen soldier became a symbol of sacrifice that justified revolution. In America, the frozen GI of the Ardennes became a legend of resilience. Proof that no matter how cruel the storm, the nation could endure. And so, we ask, is winter's true power not in breaking armies, but in shaping the stories that follow? In the next chapter, we will step away from generals and maps, to listen closer to the soldiers themselves. To the letters, the diaries, the testimonies that reveal what it truly felt like to stand against winter's cruelty. To hear their voices is to understand that wars may end, but the cold never truly leaves those who fought in it. What lingers longer, the sound of gunfire, or the silence of snow? Does a man remember the battle itself, or the nights when frost crept into his bones and whispered that he would not see the dawn? History often speaks with the voices of generals and politicians, but to truly understand which winter broke soldiers first, we must step closer into the hearts and minds of the men who endured it. Their diaries, their letters, their testimonies carry the raw truth that statistics cannot. Take the Russian peasant soldier of 1915. His letter home is short, written with a trembling hand. "Mother, I have no boots. The snow cuts my feet like knives. We are given bread, but not enough. Men die beside me each night, not from wounds, but from cold. I wonder if I will ever see spring again." His words are not of strategy, not of glory, they are of survival, or rather, the slow loss of it. These men did not fight for victory. They fought to see another sunrise, and when even that hope slipped away, their spirits collapsed. Mutinies and desertions were not acts of cowardice, they were acts of exhaustion. The final protest of bodies and minds, broken by endless winter. Now, shift to a foxhole in the Ardennes. 1944. An American GI scribbles by the dim glow of a cigarette lighter. "It is so cold, my hands bleed when I try to write. The rations are frozen. The ground is ice. We wait and wait, listening for tanks in the dark. I think of home, of warmth, of Christmas lights. But here, The snow is our enemy. His words carry the same desperation. Yet beneath them lies a different tone determination. He curses the cold, yes, but he also swears he will hold the line. He clings not to revolution, but to relief, to the belief that Patton's army is coming. That they are not forgotten, and this difference is telling. The Russian soldiers' winter ended with betrayal and collapse. The American soldiers' winter ended with rescue and victory. Yet, both carried scars. One Russian diary describes soldiers cutting strips from horse carcasses to eat, then freezing before they could finish chewing. One American veteran recalled later in life how he still woke at night hearing the crunch of snow under boots, seeing shadows moving among the trees, fearing that the forest itself was alive with enemies. The human cost of these winters was not only in bodies, but in souls. Frostbite took fingers and toes. Hunger hollowed cheeks. But the deeper wound was memory, the unshakable recollection of suffering that no medal, no victory parade could erase. Some Russian soldiers returned home, only to find their country in flames of revolution, their sacrifices forgotten. Some American soldiers came back to warmth and celebration, yet they carried with them nightmares that no cheering crowd could silence. So, which winter was crueler? The Russian winter that turned soldiers against their own nation, or the Ardennes winter that forced men to watch comrades freeze beside them, even as they clung to hope? The answer is not simple. The Russian soldier was broken in body and spirit, leading to collapse. The American soldier was battered in body, but his spirit, yet, perhaps endurance carries its own cruelty. To survive the cold is to live forever with the memory of it. As history remembers, each winter shaped nations. Russia's suffering tore down an empire and birthed revolution. America's suffering forged a legend of resilience that strengthened its identity as a global power. Both were victories of a kind, one for change, the other for endurance. But both were also tragedies, measured in the quiet deaths of men whose names we will never know. And so we return to the question, which winter broke soldiers first? Was it the Russians in World War I, abandoned by their leaders, stripped by corruption, and left to die in the snow until they broke not only as soldiers, but as a nation? Or was it the Americans in World War II, who did not break in the field, but whose frozen agony followed them home, whispering in their dreams for the rest of their lives? Perhaps the cruelest truth is this: winter does not care for sides, for flags, for causes. It breaks whoever it touches. It breaks them in different ways, some outward, some hidden, but it always leaves its mark. So the final answer is not which winter broke soldiers first, but rather that both winters broke them differently, deeply, and forever. And if you stand today in those fields, whether in the forests of the Ardennes or the plains of Eastern Europe, you will hear nothing but silence. Yet, listen closely, and you may still catch the echoes. The crunch of boots on frozen ground, the whispers of men praying for dawn, the voices of soldiers who learned that sometimes the greatest enemy is not across the battlefield, but all around you, in the cold, in the snow, in the endless winter that never truly ends.